What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. And today's video, I wanted to go over the mentality and mindset for combat sports, as well as some talking points kind of in that category. So, one thing, you always hear about discipline, consistency, persistence, and I come wholeheartedly and completely agree with all of those. All of those are needed, especially when pursuing combat sports, and especially if you want to compete in combat sports. But one thing for sure is whenever you're in combat sports, it's always extremely important that no matter what your skill level is, right? Whether today is your first day, you're a professional fighter, world champion, or coach, whatever. Always be in a growth mindset, in a mindset that's always willing to learn, right? For example, luckily in my gym, we have a very awesome fight camp program. And our fighters, they're always willing to get feedback. They're always willing to learn and grow. It doesn't matter how many fights they have because, win or lose, they learn something, right? And, I kind of want to talk briefly about winning. Even winning, if you let's just say you're an undefeated fighter, you have to be careful because there's a saying in the military that's called complacency kills. And that's a very true saying for a reason. It's easy once you get to the top that you think you've made it, right? And that's how, honestly, a lot of these, good, great fighters fall, is that once they get to the top, they're like, okay, cool, I've made it. I can do this, whatever. I deserve this or whatever. It happened to Conor McGregor and all these other great fighters. But in reality, once you make it to the top, it doesn't matter. You have to still be consistent. You have to still be persistent. You have to still train every day, especially in combat sports, right? Because just because you have, a title, belt, whatever, whether it be an amateur belt, world title, whatever, there's always people gunning for your spot, always people, that are hungry coming up. And that's what makes, combat sports so special, in my opinion, is that, even if you've made it to the highest level and you've accomplished all this stuff, the work is always, there's always more work to be done. And something also what I want to say was, to take advantage of seminars. This is kind of piggybacking and always be opening to learn. But my two most recent seminars with Sagat and Smoking Joe Nottawa, were very eye-opening, great seminars. I learned a lot, and I got to see how, these world champions, kind of operate in their training routine. But again, that always comes in from the growth mindset, right? I'm always constantly learning. I'm always taking information, and I'm always striving to be better. I always say, be 1% better every day. And one thing is, always ask questions. If you don't know something, ask. I've mentioned this about in other videos, but especially if you're new, I'll watch these new people in class. They'll do a combo, whether it be on a heavy bag or pad work or whatever, and they clearly don't understand, what was being talked about, or they don't understand, or they don't remember the combination, whatever, and they'll just sit there and they'll look around and like, oh, crap. Be assertive. You have to be willing to learn and ask questions, because especially if you don't understand something and you're not asking questions, how are you going to learn? Another thing is, especially with combat sports, I don't think people realize how hard it is and how much time, work, discipline, consistency it takes to really be good at these sports. It's easy to see, fights on the UFC or, boxing or whatever, right? And, look at these great fighters and be like, oh man, that's so cool. Whatever, that looks so much fun. Like, that'd be so cool to be a UFC fighter or whatever. But it takes years of discipline, sacrifice, consistency, and persistence, to get to that level, right? And, this is something that's, it's not like something that you get right away. It's not something that you understand right away, there's no instant gratification in combat sports. And that's actually one of the reasons why I love combat sports so much, is because of that fact. I feel like in this day and age, most people, they're all about the instant gratification. I want it now, whatever. And I feel like, with a lot of the world now, that's how we're kind of being conditioned to be. So, for the fact that this sport, regardless of what discipline it is in combat sports, it takes, years of time, dedication, and consistency. That's what I love about it. And, always look for ways to get better, right? And always be looking for ways to improve on what you already know. Like even if it's, like shadow boxing a little bit more, doing more jump rope, running more, whatever, right? All those are things that can, put you ahead of your competition, because trust me, in a game like this, in combat sports, there's plenty of competition. And one thing, I feel like most people don't really understand, especially, they can easily watch something happen on, like, TV, like watch a UFC fight or watch a boxing fight, Muay Thai fight, whatever, and they're getting hurt. It's like, okay, cool, I can do that, right? But at the end of the day, I personally know, fighters that, have started their amateur careers, and, once they get into the ring or whatever, they like kind of start to freak out because it finally dawns on them, like, holy crap, this person is legitimately trying to hurt me, and that shifts, like how you view the world a little bit and how you look at things, because, most people aren't really prepared for that. They're not really prepared to really understand, hey, there's a person here that legitimately wants to cause me harm. They actually want me to go to the hospital or whatever. They want to win. And, especially if you think, if you're just kind of used to play fighting or play sparring, whatever, that's kind of like a rude and crude awakening for some people. And I've seen that happen. So, just really, really take time to really physically understand, especially if you want to compete, whether it be amateur or professional fighting, this person wants to hurt me. Or even if you're training for self-defense, if you're training for self-defense and that time comes, you have to be prepared to dish out violence, because there's this person, especially in a self-defense scenario, that wants to hurt you. And I feel like, people are like, oh yeah, I know that, right? And they kind of brush it off. But I don't think people really understand the fact that whether it be in a self-defense scenario or in a fight, someone's actually trying to hurt you. They think it's more of like a hard sparring session, but that's just not the case. And, you have to be extremely mentally tough, because this, combat sports and a lot of combat disciplines, that's what they require, right? They require for you to show up on days when you don't want to train, and be consistent, even when you don't want to. I mean, there's luckily I've been kind of in a good groove right now as far as training goes, but there was a couple weeks, a few months ago, where literally every day, I get off work and I'm like, oh man, I don't want to go to the gym. I don't want to lift weights. I don't want to go to Muay Thai, because I was just tired, and that's part of the game. Every single fighter has experienced it, even all the greats, they talk about it, right? It's all about showing up and being consistent and disciplined, even when you don't feel like it. And, there's a lot of people nowadays that's really hard, because it goes back to the instant gratification or, the comfort. Another reason why I love combat sports is because you are, as long as you're learning, you are consistently outside of your comfort zone all the time. And that forces you to learn and grow. And, most people don't like being out of their comfort zone. They want to stay comfortable. But especially for someone who's into combat sports, wants to compete or whatever, you have to be okay with the fact that you will be uncomfortable all the time. And it doesn't matter what level you are. It doesn't matter the experience you have. It just doesn't matter. You will be uncomfortable. And that's just another reason why I love the combat sports, because especially when I transitioned out of the military, it was very hard for me, because I felt like people were too soft. I felt like people were too comfortable, and martial arts, especially Muay Thai, for me has really helped me kind of channel that anger, and put it towards something I believe is good, and kind of help me kind of regain that sort of military mentality, mindset is like, hey, like you have to be uncomfortable in order to grow. And that's something that I learned the hard way in the military. And every single day, when you're uncomfortable, or you're getting pushed, where you're learning, it's that much better for you in the long run, because you're like, hey, I'm actually learning, I'm growing, I'm pushing myself. I'm not staying comfortable. I'm not, being complacent. I'm not doing anything, right? It gives you that sense of purpose. And that was something that I lacked for a long time. Now, as far as competing and being in a competition mindset, so this is something that I learned actually kind of relatively recently, and it may sound dumb, but don't get fixated on the outcomes, especially if you're looking to compete in like an amateur level, right? I remember, you know, talking to some of my, fellow, peers at the gym, and they were, especially one of them. He's a fight coming up actually this next Friday. But he was like totally like, okay, this is my first amateur fight. It's full contact. I'm extremely nervous. I'm scared. I have to win. And he's one of the best fighters we have at our gym. He's been practicing for 5 years. He's very good, very athletic, has great cardio, great form. But he's putting all this pressure on himself because of that. Like, hey, I'm essentially expected to hold this, this image of myself that people perceive of me. And not to say that he is not capable at all of winning the fight, but I feel like, when you're putting all that pressure on yourself, it may diminish your actual performance in the fight. And instead of, being like, okay, I have to win, I have to do this, whatever, I have to knock him out, right? Just focus on growing and learning and using every fight, to learn. You're there to learn, you're there to grow, you're there to build your record, and let, your expertise in your training, and your inevitable victories be a side effect of that, right? Because you're going to learn, grow, get better as you continue to fight, as you get more fights under your belt and stuff like that. And I've mentioned this before in another video, but especially whether you're just starting combat sports or martial arts, or you're learning a technique or whatever, I feel like most people are afraid or don't want to look stupid in the beginning. And that is so stupid, because obviously if you are starting something new, you're not going to get it on your first try. So why, expect to be perfect on the first try, right? Even world champions, with multiple belts who have been fighting for years are not perfect. I guarantee there's things that they ruthlessly beat themselves up over, or they go into a fight and then make a mistake, right? Because even at the highest level, world champions can still get knocked out because they zigged instead of zagged. So don't let that be an inhibitor for continuing your growth, because I see it time and time again, especially with some of the newer people that come to the gym. They beat themselves up, or they're so worried about looking kind of dumb and having crap form or whatever, that they don't actually want to learn and grow, which I think is extremely stupid. Now, so another thing that I wanted to talk about is age. I'm not, I'm in my 20s. I'm not tremendously old or whatever, but I know there's even some new folks that are coming to the gym that are very worried about their age being an inhibitor of, their pursuit of combat sports and martial arts. But age is just a number, and this was something that I kind of struggled with, because I recently got into martial arts and I kind of got a little bit later in the game, because, look at a lot of these champions, that started when they're like 7 to 11 years old, and they've been fighting forever, right? But it's just that age is just a number. The only inhibitor for your performance and how great you become is your mind, and that ties back into the mindset of things, right? So just know that, and just know that you're never too old to start, you're never too old to do anything. There's plenty of UFC fighters that were winning and even boxers that were winning, world championship belts in their 40s, So just keep that in mind. Don't let that deter you. Another thing is, especially when, you're struggling with stuff, for some people, their gym, just like the military for me, like that's their family, that's their support system. And so use it. If you have questions, even that's not fight related or just stuff that's kind of going on in your life, use your support system. Use your friends, use your family, use your gym. Because I promise you, especially in a gym setting, especially if you're going to a healthy gym, everyone wants you to learn, everyone wants you to grow, and just take advantage of that. The last thing I wanted to say was, combat sports can get ugly. It's not always going to be fun and learning and having whatever. And just know that's part of it, and especially if you want to get into combat sports, it's going to happen. You might have some really bad losses, or you might get injured or whatever. Unfortunately, a couple weeks ago, one of our older classmates in my class, we were doing some pad work, and I wish her all the best, but I know that her nutrition is not the best. She doesn't really do a lot of mobility exercise. She doesn't stretch. She does a lot of stuff, I would say incorrectly. And I'm not trying to bash her or anything like that, but, she's an amazing person, and I want her to come back healthy and succeed or whatever. But, she does some stuff incorrectly. Like I said, she doesn't warm up and stuff like that. But holding pad drills, she threw a punch and ended up dislocating her shoulder, which is very unfortunate, but like stuff like that happens, and you have to be kind of aware of that and always not be afraid of it, but just be aware. And just know that, if and when that does happen to you, you have to be physically and mentally tough enough to respond, get better and not let that inhibit you, and just come back stronger. Well, guys, that's all I have for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and let me know if there's anything I missed. And let me know, guys, if you guys agree with me. If you guys think that, some of the stuff I mentioned is what you need to be a professional combat sports or a fighter. Anyways, guys, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.